So this is my Brion Stoutarm Commander deck, and this deck was originally built as a very aggressive deck that sort of sought to abuse Brion's ability to force through 40 points of damage as quickly as possible. And I think that's how most people build Brion. They use a lot of threat and effects to steal people's creatures and then throw them, as well as fire-breathing creatures which you can pump up, swing, and then throw them for a ton of extra damage. So that's how this deck used to work, and it was pretty good, but we found that the best way to get the most out of these colors was to focus on a more control-oriented strategy, sort of like resource denial spells. So this eventually evolved into a hybrid deck which can come at you two different ways, with a highly aggressive strategy, as well as some control elements mixed in. So I think the most unique thing about this deck is that it uses what I think is the most challenging two-color combination in this format. Because red and white, I think a lot of people will agree, are the two weakest colors. The reasons being, you don't really have access to good mana ramp, you don't have access to good card draw, and the tutors aren't that great either. And those are sort of the main pillars of this format, and you can't get them very well from these colors. So what you end up having to do is come up with creative ways to get those effects. Like, for instance, you can resort to artifacts for mana ramp, use some non-traditional methods of card advantage rather than card draw, and come up with ways to sort of even the playing field. Like, if other colors have access to a lot better cards, then you can sort of come up with ways to let them not play those cards. So I guess what I'm saying is you have to resort to some douchebag tactics, so to speak, and you know, if you feel bad about that, then remind yourself that you're really challenging yourself with these colors, and evening the playing field is the best chance you have. So I don't really want to rag on red-white. Like, it's a very fun color combination, and it lets you play with some creative cards that most people might not have heard of. For example, I think the best equipment in the format is red-white, as well as one of the most aggressive lands in the format. So you get to play with some cool cards, and you get to come up with some creative strategies. And this is a pretty fun deck. I think it's a very popular general. Like I said, mostly because it's a unique color combination, but I think a lot of people like to abuse the ability as well. So I'll take you through this primer, and hopefully you'll get some ideas for your Brion deck. So first I want to talk about Brion himself. And like I said before, I'm not really abusing his ability to the extent that a lot of Brion decks do. A lot of players like to use those threaten cards, which are ones that, you know, steal an opponent's creature for one turn, it gains haste, and then you give it back. So you use those cards, swing with the creature, and then use Brion's ability to sacrifice the creature rather than give it back. I'm not crazy about that strategy. It turns out it's sort of a lot of work for what ends up being a one-for-one trade-off, plus a bunch of damage attached to it. And if you can't keep Brion on the table, then those threatened cards are kind of dead cards in your hand. That said, I do have lots of ways that this deck can abuse Brion's ability. It's always useful to have a sacrifice outlet on your general, because a lot of the time you need to kill off your creature. So we do have a lot of ways to abuse that. We've also got some cards that abuse his lifelink ability, so we have some life-oriented cards, and having that ability on your general gives you access to some interesting card choices. Furthermore, Brion is a 4/4 lifelinker for 4, which is a pretty aggressive body. Like I said, this deck can also win with an aggressive strategy, and having a general who's efficiently costed definitely helps with that. A lot of the best cards in this deck are equipments, so it's nice that I always have access to this reasonably sized creatures to wield those swords and stuff, and get the card advantage that comes with those equipments. So first I want to talk about all the creatures in this deck, and as you can see, the mana curve is pretty evenly split right across the board. Most of the cheaper creatures are utility creatures, and what I'm looking for here are creatures who basically help with the strategies we talked about before. Resource denial, creative ways to generate card advantage or tutoring, and as we get to the higher casting costs, we have cards that work towards our aggro strategy. So we're looking for highly aggressive creatures who need to be answered right away, and also ones who work with the resource denial strategy. So I'll take you through these creatures one by one. So I'm going to start off with some of the aggressive creatures in this deck. These first two here are both 1-drops, and they're both great for dealing damage early on in the game before anyone has sort of the resources to come up with removal spells. But the important thing with an aggressive 1-drop is that it's still relevant late in the game. This first one here, Serra Ascendant, comes out as a 6/6 flyer lifelink for 1 mana, which is pretty busted. Definitely one of the deadliest creatures you can drop on the first turn, especially if you can find a player at the table who's, off to a slow start, they don't have access to their removal spells right away. You can set them way behind with this card. And because you only need 30 life total, and you've got a general with lifelink, it's pretty easy to keep that up in the late game, and this card is relevant even later on, so definitely fits this deck well. Figure of Destiny, this is another creature that's very efficient on the first turn, can swing for 2 and then 4 on the second and third turns, so it's a really strong card. But the good news is that it actually is relevant later in the game as well, because an 8/8 flyer is going to be bigger than most threats at that time, so most dragons and angels are smaller than that. So Figure of Destiny I think is worth a spot. It's nice to have some aggressive creatures so that you can have some board presence early on. And then the one that ties them together, Ranger of Eos. I think this is a very interesting card in white, and it's one of those cards we want to watch out for, because I think we're 1 or 2 good printings away from this being, white's version of Trinket Mage. Once we have a couple of more utility white creatures, then this thing's really going to shoot up in value in this format. In this deck, it's got 3 targets. These 2 here, if I want to go for a very aggressive play, Ranger of Eos can tutor up what are actually, very, very massive creatures. And in total, if I top deck Ranger of Eos late game, then I can put 17 power on the board if I can pump up Figure of Destiny, and I'm still at 30 life. So Ranger of Eos is actually a pretty deadly card in this deck. Almost kind of like a tooth and nail, but let's not go that far. It's actually got 1 other target in this deck, and I'll get to that one later. Some more aggressive creatures here. This one here, Baneslayer Angel. Mostly playing with this one just because I want to. 5/5 for 5 flyer. It's pretty efficient, but it's not going to be as relevant in a format which is dominated by 6/6s. However, protection from dragons is going to protect her from a lot of those 6/6s, and first strike and lifelink means she's going to be really good with equipments. So she is pretty good in this deck, and just one of my favorite cards to play with. Then Akroma here, another angel. This one's a pretty aggressive creature if you play it for the morph cost, because it's going to come out swinging on turn 6. And this is one of the few, I guess the only fire-breathing creature that remained in the deck after I cut a bunch of those out. And like I said before, fire-breathing is great with Brion Stoutarm, because I can pump her up to, maybe a 11/6, swing for 11, and then throw her for 11 more. So that's a ton of damage I can get in 1 turn. Can't be countered. Protection from very relevant colors means that she's going to be hard to deal with, depending on the deck. And then Felidar Sovereign. This creature isn't aggressive in terms of efficient beating, but it's sort of aggressive in terms of you have to deal with this or I'm going to win. I think a lot of the decks that run this actually have trouble staying above 40 life, but this is a deck that has access to a lot of life gain, so Felidar Sovereign works really well. I don't think it's as busted as people say it is, but it's definitely something that can potentially end the game if you're not prepared to deal with it. Getting into some utility creatures here. Like I said, you're going to have to come up with some creative ways to make up for the shortcomings in these colors. So you're going to need some colorless mana ramp, and Solemn Simulacrum is definitely one way to do that. He's also one of the best trump blockers in the format, because a lot of people don't want to attack into him for some reason, just because they don't want to give you a card when they could attack somebody else instead. Of course, you could always sacrifice him to Brion Stoutarm, do a couple damage, and draw a card, but mostly he's here just as a colorless way to put me forward 1 land. Weathered Wayfarer, this is one of the interesting cards in white. It's the other creature in this deck which is fetchable with Ranger of Eos, so that's another thing to note. But this is actually the first of several tutoring engines in this deck, and if this is one of the rare tutoring cards that white has access to, you're going to have to abuse it the best you can. So what it does is it searches your deck for lands, any land, not just basic, and if your opponents control more lands than you do, then you get to use this pretty sick ability. So what you can do is make sure that you have a bunch of utility available in your non-basic lands. So make sure you're running lands which can work as ramp, lands which can work as aggressive threats, and lands which can work as resource denial. So depending on how you build your mana base, Weathered Wayfarer is actually a toolbox card. Definitely an awesome card to drop on turn 1, fetchable with Ranger of Eos, and relevant later in the game as well. It's actually worth it to sometimes skip your land drop just so that you can get this ability online. Some more examples of some non-traditional tutoring in white. White is actually pretty good at tutoring for equipments. So this first one here, Stoneforge Mystic. Pretty efficient card at only 2 mana. Lets me search my deck for any equipment and put it in my hand. This ability here is actually pretty handy for sneaking equipments past counter magic at instant speed, so that actually ends up being pretty relevant. I guess my favorite target for Stoneforge Mystic is Sunforger, which is the best equipment in this format, I think, and we're going to talk more about that one later. And now we get to Stonehewer Giant, one of the real bombs in white. This is the kind of card that can sort of win the game all on its own if it's, for whatever reason, left alone to do whatever it wants. It's another tutoring engine that this deck has access to. I guess my favorite target for this, first of all, is Lightning Greaves, because then I can suit him up with that and then go and grab all my other equipments one by one. And yeah, he's a beast, and if people let you get away with it, he can win the game by himself. So I talked before about having to come up with some non-traditional methods of card advantage, and Graveyard Recursion is one way to do that, especially if you can get it on an engine card like one of these two. So this first one here, Argivian Archaeologist, I don't think many people have heard of this one. So for 3 mana we get a 1/1 creature, and you can pay 2 and tap it to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. This isn't something I'm going to abuse for a combo, it's mostly just to safeguard the artifacts I run in this deck. There are 18 in total in this deck, including some pretty aggressive things like equipments that people want to destroy because they end up being, the most powerful card on the board. So you'll want some way to safeguard your investments in artifacts, and this is one way that we can stay aggressive late in the game. So definitely an interesting card in white, and it's a fun card to play with in this deck. And then Sun Titan here. One of the best cards in the white in this whole format, I think. One of my favorites for sure. It has a ton of targets in this deck. For instance, the swords and lightning greaves, those are the kind of cards that tend to get blown up right away. So it's nice to be able to bring those back. As well, some of the most annoying creatures in this deck fit into that 3 or less category, and you're going to see some of those in a minute. But this is definitely something that can help give this deck some resilience, give this deck a good endgame strategy, and generate some card advantage. Some more white creatures with recursion utility. We've got Karmic here, always a solid choice. For 5 mana, I can bring back a creature. Sometimes I'll actually want to pay the Echo against a black deck. Protection from a black, definitely useful. And a 2/2 flyer, if I can suit that up with an equipment, then it's definitely a relevant presence on the board. But mostly it's just good to have some recursion in this deck, and that's why this one's here. Adarkar Valkyrie, this is one that actually works really well with Brion's ability, because I can sacrifice a creature, throwing it with Brion, get some damage, and then tap the Valkyrie to bring it back. This works especially well with any creature that has a come into play or a leaves play ability, so I can recur that ability and get it over and over again. And I've definitely got a few creatures that work well with that strategy. So the Valkyrie definitely works well in this deck. And then Twilight Shepherd, similar effect. I can sacrifice a creature to Brion and then cast the Shepherd to bring it back. So this is a useful creature in this deck, not only because it works well with Brion, it's also a good resiliency creature. With Persist, it means that if the board gets blown up while I have this in play, the Angel will come back and save all the permanents I just lost. So it's nice to have that sort of insurance factor there, and both of these two Angels here are pretty aggressive creatures, 4/5 and 5/5 flying vigilance, so they're especially good if I can get some equipments on them, because anything with evasion works well with swords. Some more utility creatures here with some aggressive upside. Archon of Justice as a 4/4 flyer for 5 is a pretty solid aggressive creature. The ability here is also really good with my general, because I've always got access to that sack outlet, which means I can turn this into a Vindicate whenever I need it. Definitely a useful card in this deck. Duplicant seems to find its way into almost every deck I make, and like I've said many times before, it's going to be one of the most aggressive creatures on the board, because it's always going to go after the biggest creature. So it's removal as well as a big threat for only 6 mana, always a solid choice. These two here work well with the Adarkar Valkyrie, Brion Stoutarm synergy that I just talked about, and with Duplicant you can even recur it with Argivian Archaeologist. Soltari Guerillas, sort of an interesting choice available to red-white. I don't think many people have heard of this one. For 4 mana, a 3/2 Shadow, and whenever it assigns combat damage to any opponent, you may redirect that damage to target creature. It does not have to be a creature controlled by that opponent, which is interesting. But the cool thing with this card is that, Lightning Bolt isn't very effective in this format, but if you have access to 1 Lightning Bolt every turn, you can do some pretty nasty things. And that's pretty much what this card is. It's going to give me 3 damage to any target creature or player every turn, because not many people are going to have a shadow creature to block this, so he can run rampant. He's especially good in this deck because I run so many dangerous equipments, and he's going to grab those and go unblockable with them. He's going to get the effects, and he's going to, machine gun all the utility creatures on the table, and sort of something you have to play with to realize just how useful it is, but it's definitely an interesting choice. Next we're going to get into some of the resource denial creatures. Like I said before, this deck can really benefit from red and white because they have access to some resource denial cards, especially cards that attack people's mana bases, which is what these ones do. So first of all, we have Dwarven Blastminer and Dwarven Miner, who looks an awful lot like Fat Bastard from Austin Powers, but at the end of the day, these two cards are pretty much the same thing. A 2-drop that attacks non-basic lands. Next we've got Magus of the Moon, which is basically Blood Moon on a stick. Non-basic lands become mountains. It can hurt this deck as well, but I'm running red cards, so I can usually benefit from this more than anyone else. But basically these cards are all going to hose people for running non-basic lands, and for some people, one of these early in the game is just game over, because some people build their decks entirely out of non-basics, and they have no contingency strategy for a play like these. So these are, some people call them douchebag cards, but sometimes it's the best hope you have in a red deck, and I like these cards a lot. Definitely very strong. Some more interesting resource denial creatures. This one here, Stonecloaker. There's a lot to take in here because he does a whole bunch of stuff. And he's one of these utility creatures who's always going to be useful because you can use him to attack somebody's graveyard, which is something every deck needs to be able to do. A lot of decks run recursion strategies and they're going to generate card advantage that way. So if you can put a stop to that, then you can put them behind. It's also useful for the ability to return creatures you control back to your hand. This is important if someone shoots a Path to Exile at your Stonehewer Giant, and that's the kind of creature that you really want to save. So Stonecloaker can act as a sort of a surprise counterspell in that respect. So one of those utility creatures that you definitely want to have in your white deck if you have room. And then one of my favorites, Aven Mindcensor. Like I said before, one of the best things you can do in these colors is try to even the playing field somehow. And we don't have access to a ton of tutors in this deck, and the ones we do have access to are kind of narrow. So if we can shut down the blue, black, and green players' really strong tutors, which are a lot more versatile than ours, then that'll give us a chance to even the playing field. So Aven Mindcensor shuts down tutors, and my advice for this card is don't, hold on to it all game, leaving 3 mana open, hoping to catch somebody off guard as they cast a tutor or pop a fetch land. Just put it into play as soon as you have the mana, flash it in at end of turn, but don't sit on it in your hand all game, otherwise you'll fall behind really fast. Now we get to some creatures that can potentially lock players out of the game entirely. Iona, definitely a hoser for monocolored decks, but it can really hurt any 2-color decks as well. It's especially good in a multiplayer game if you can catch 2 or 3 players running red or something, then you can shut them down. Okay, red's a bad example, maybe blue. That's the obvious choice, I guess. 7/7 flyer is also going to make it the biggest creature on the board most of the time. 9 mana can be a problem, but this deck is running a ton of artifact mana, so we can usually excel to this and get it as soon as possible, which can be annoying for some players for sure. Next we have Yosei the Morning Star. This is another creature which I abuse Brion with a lot, so I have a sack outlet in my general, which means I can shut down at least one player in the game, tap down their permanents, and don't let them untap. It's basically a time warp in a 1v1 game, but in a multiplayer game I can just take out the combo player and make sure he's not going to untap for a few turns. And one of the ways I can do that is by setting up a recursion engine with Yosei and maybe a Adarkar Valkyrie, Sword of Light and Shadow. Some way to bring Yosei back every turn, keep sacrificing him to Brion Stoutarm, and yeah, I can set up a lock with this pretty well. It's also just I don't need to set up a lock with it to win the game. I can just use it to stop a player from untapping and getting access to their removal spells. I'm playing an aggressive deck, so just one turn of not letting them untap, that might be enough to get way ahead and take them out the next turn. So Yosei is definitely a good card in this deck. And then we have the Eldrazi. There's not a whole lot to say about these. I'm running a deck with a ton of Artifact Excel, and the best thing you can do with 10 or 11 mana is to drop one of these guys. Kozilek is going to give this deck access to some much needed card draw, and Ulamog is always just a great choice. Destroy a permanent and indestructible makes him really hard to deal with. Annihilator is going to play towards that resource denial strategy we've been talking about, and these are definitely one of the easiest ways I can win the game if I have a ton of quick mana. Moving into our non-creature spells, we've got some utility removal here. Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, these are going to go into every white deck I make. It's a straightforward 1-for-1 killer creature, but very efficient at 1 mana, instant speed. I love these cards, go into any white deck. And then Condemn here. This one's especially interesting. It can only hit attacking creatures, which means it's not going to hit the annoying utility ones, but the fact that it can take a general and stick it on the bottom of someone's deck, take it out of the game for the foreseeable future, that's what makes Condemn very valuable. So this one's definitely worth a spot as well. Then these two up here, these are good for artifact and enchantment destruction. Orm's Thunder is a very cool card available to red-white decks. Destroy an artifact or enchantment, and then you get to kick it and hopefully take out one of their creatures as well. So it's a very useful 2-for-1, good utility removal spell in this deck. And then Return to Dust. Definitely one of my favorite cards in white. Another 2-for-1 effect. If I play it during my turn, I can hit double disenchant. I think this card's going to go up in value once people realize that Blightsteel Colossus can be killed. So I definitely like this card a lot. So sticking with removal spells, we're going to talk about the sweepers in this deck next. And any deck that has access to white is going to have a ton of options for sweepers. But I think the best one in the format is Austere Command. And the reason for that is that you can customize this spell to make sure you always come out on top. So whatever your opponent has on the board, you can hopefully name those cards and leave behind whatever your strong suit is. So I really like Austere Command a lot. It goes into every white deck I make. And Hallowed Burial. This is another very interesting card. In theory, it looks like it should see a lot of play because it has this general tucking ability, which means you can take generals out of the game for the foreseeable future. In practice, it actually doesn't see a ton of play because a lot of people play recursion strategies and they don't want to hurt their own graveyard, and a lot of people play decks which are reliant on the general, so they don't want to risk tucking their own general either. This is a deck, though, that isn't too reliant on recursion, and it also doesn't really mind if we lose the general either. So this is a deck that can really take advantage of Hallowed Burial, and this spell is potentially huge if you can catch a ton of players off guard and hopefully tuck a bunch of generals at once. And at the end of the day, it's just a decent Wrath spell for 5 mana, so definitely worth playing. Catastrophe. I really like this card in any aggressive white deck because it can either be a Wrath of God or an Armageddon. And like I said with Austere Command, customizable cards are always great because it's always going to be relevant no matter what the board position is. So, if you're behind in board position, your opponents have more creatures than you, then it's a Wrath. But if you're ahead and you've got, winning damage on the table, then you can blow up the lands and make sure that you're going to win within the next few turns. So I really like Catastrophe in any aggressive white deck, and I think this card should see more play than it does because it's really, really good. And then Decree of Annihilation, 10 mana is going to completely reset the game. Well, not completely, it leaves behind enchantments, which is interesting. There's actually a good synergy with this and another spell we're going to talk about later. I guess the main reason this is in the deck is because you can cycle it to blow up all the lands. And any aggressive deck that has access to mass land destruction should consider running it because it's a good way you can seal up a win if you have good board presence. Take out the lands and then people can't deal with your threats. You're going to end the game pretty quickly. So I like Decree of Annihilation in this deck. A good segue from Catastrophe and Decree of Annihilation. We've got a couple other cards here which attack players' mana bases. Armageddon. This card doesn't mess around, just 4 mana, blow up all the lands in play. I really like effects like this in any aggressive deck. Like I said, set up yourself with a bunch of creatures and then blow up lands so that they can't deal with them. It's especially good in this deck because we run a ton of artifact mana, so we'll be able to recover the fastest from blowing up all the lands. Blood Moon here, same effect as Magus of the Moon, turn all non-basics into mountains. Punish the players who are running really expensive mana bases and 3-color decks. So with these cards and the dwarves that we talked about earlier, Catastrophe, Decree of Annihilation, Magus of the Moon, we have a ton of spells that attack players' mana bases. Sort of fits with the resource denial strategy that we're going for. You're not going to make too many friends that way, but you're going to win more games than you otherwise would with access to only red and white. Moving into our card draw spells, like I said before, you really don't have much to choose from in red and white, but thankfully we do have some artifact spells which help us draw cards. Sensei's Divining Top, not exactly card draw, but fixing your draws every turn works just as well, so make sure you're always going to draw something that's relevant to you right away. This one is another one of those cards that seems to find its way into all my decks. Mind's Eye, 5 mana, and you're going to draw a ton of cards in a multiplayer game. This one's always relevant. Something you want to try and get some value out of before somebody blows it up, because it tends to draw the ire of other players at the table, but it's one way this deck can put together some card advantage. And then Memory Jar. This one's a very interesting effect. It's going to give you 7 new cards just for one turn. It's kind of hard to execute this properly because sometimes you have to cast it and then sort of leave it there for one turn until you can untap, because the more mana you have, the more likely you're able to get some value out of this card. So you want to set yourself up with some artifact mana and then hopefully get a big Memory Jar all in one turn. Hopefully be able to cast most of those cards you draw. Wheel of Fortune, we do have access to one really good card draw spell in red. This thing's really good, especially if you dump your hand early on, maybe ramping in with artifact mana and dumping down some cheap creatures. So this is one way that red can refill its hand. Then Well of Lost Dreams, pretty terrible in most decks, but if you have a lifelinking general, then it's definitely relevant. I don't usually like cards which are useless without having your general out, but we do have other ways to gain life, and if I can get this thing going, it is really, really good because, Brion is gaining me 4 life per turn, so I can draw a ton of cards off this. If I can even get it to work once, then, it's done its job. So I like this one a lot, sort of a silver bullet in this deck. Moving into our tutors, doesn't look like I have a lot here, but I've already talked about Weathered Wayfarer and Stonehewer Giant, which are both really good tutoring engines, and I'm going to get to Sunforger later. So this deck does have quite a few tutoring options. Enlightened Tutor, really, really good in this deck, like I said before. I have 18 artifacts and a few enchantments as well. So this thing is a very versatile card. It can grab me some mana ramp on my first turn, it can grab some really aggressive equipments, or it can get some good enchantments. I have a really good game-ending enchantment that this thing can target. So I really like this card a lot. And then Gamble, pretty decent tutor in red. Obviously it's a bit risky, but the sooner on you cast this, the less likely you are to lose the card that you gamble up. But it's definitely worth running. And then Land Tax, not really a tutor, it can only get basic lands, but this is one of my favorite cards to drop on the first turn, because it's going to make sure that I hit all of my land drops, which is very important. It's also going to make sure that I thin out my deck and make sure I'm drawing fewer basics. Like I said before, I do have a card in this deck that works well with Decree of Annihilation, and that's Land Tax, because Decree does not hit enchantments. So if I can Decree of Annihilation leaving Land Tax on the board, and if I was, smart enough to leave some basic lands in my deck, then that's a pretty good combo. It means that I'm going to be the one to bounce back the fastest. But yeah, I like Land Tax a lot. Make sure I always hit my land drops. So I keep talking about how dangerous the equipments in this deck are, and that's because I'm running all the best ones. Lightning Greaves, very important in any aggressive deck because haste makes sure that your creatures are going to be relevant the turn they come out. Shroud is also very useful because I can do some pretty nasty things with Stonehewer Giant, Adarkar Valkyrie. If I can make sure those creatures are not going to get removed, then I can abuse them pretty heavily. So Lightning Greaves is definitely a good tutor target if I want to make sure that I have access to haste. And Umezawa's Jitte is Sword of Light and Shadow and Sword of Fire and Ice, the staple swords for most aggressive decks. These ones are good because they give me access to abilities that I wouldn't normally have in my colors, so some reliable recursion, some card draw, and some spot removal. These things come in handy. They're also very, very aggressive cards. I have a lot of flyers in this deck, and these things are really good to stick on an unblockable creature. So these are definitely fun cards to play with. They're very efficient. Come out early in the game and equip them to Brion. Maybe get some good general damage in. So moving on to the Holy Grail of red-white decks. Sunforger I think is the best equipment in this format. Obviously it doesn't see a lot of play because it's in somewhat clunky colors, but when you do have access to these colors, you get to play with a real gem here. Sunforger, equipped creature gets +4/+0, which means it's going to be probably the most aggressive creature on the board. And you can unattach it to search your deck for a red or white instant, convert a mana cost 4 or less, and play that without paying its mana cost. So this card is basically a toolbox card. So to show you what I have access to, it's going to give me all of my removal spells here. So Sunforger means you're not going to be able to keep a creature on the board for very long, or an artifact or enchantment for that matter. It's also going to give me access to Enlightened Tutor, which means I have access to those 18 artifacts, as well as, land tax, Vicious Shadows. So Sunforger, by proxy, offers me a whole bunch of other cards in my deck as well. And then of course I can grab Price of Progress, which, as we talked about before, is a surprise game-ending spell. So Sunforger literally does it all. It's my favorite target for Stonehewer Giant or Stoneforge Mystic. It's definitely one of those cards that defines this archetype. Really fun to play with, so if you find yourself in these colors, then you get to play with a really fun card. So you've probably noticed up until now that most of the cards in this deck are white. That's because red doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table, but one thing that red is really good at doing is playing massive game-ending spells. And Price of Progress is one of my new favorites. I've recently discovered just how good this card is. People play a ton of non-basic lands, and this is something that you cast really late in the game, and deal 24 or 30 damage to the player who's been abusing Primeval Titan or Knight of the Reliquary. And yeah, I love Price of Progress a lot. People never see this one coming, and it's the kind of card that you can cast without any board position at all and just take every player out of the game. So I like this one a lot. And then Vicious Shadows, one of those terrible cards that was always worth 50 cents and somehow found a place in EDH. Yeah, whenever any creature dies, you deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. People tend to have a lot of cards in their hand right up until the end, so if you resolve this spell, then people are going to start looking at the creatures on the board, looking at how many cards they have in their hand, and they're going to start feeling pretty nervous about the next Wrath of God, because you can end the game with this pretty quickly. Works well with Brion Stoutarm, throw some creatures around, and cause a lot of damage to one player in one turn. So these are two cards that can end the game pretty quickly if people let you get them off. And speaking of ending the game quickly, I think this is sort of the reason a lot of people like to play Brion Stoutarm, sort of a cheesy combo you can pull off with this guy. Serra Avatar, I guess I forgot to talk about this one in the creatures section earlier, but here it is. Power and toughness equal to my life total, and yeah, basically if you're playing a Brion deck, your life total is probably going to be the highest one on the board, so throwing this at someone is almost always going to be an instant kill. So yeah, that's why it's in the deck. This deck is really good at, surprise, I'm going to kill you this turn. It's especially good if I can equip it with a Lightning Greaves or back it up with a Hall of the Bandit Lord. So I swing at one player and then throw it at another player. That's a nice stylish way to kill two birds with one stone. Phyrexian Processor, basically the same idea. Turn my life into a giant creature and throw it at somebody for lethal. And of course Brion has lifelink, so I'm going to get all that life right back. And yeah, sort of a cheesy way to end the game with this deck, but it's one way that you can always pose a constant threat, and I like it a lot. So like I said before, this deck runs a lot of artifact mana. I think artifact mana is great in any deck that runs a ton of mass land destruction, because it means that you're going to be the quickest one to recover, you're going to be the one who still has access to lots of mana. And as you've seen before, this deck has a ton of big creatures, the Ionas, the Eldrazi, lots of spells that we want to excel into as soon as possible. So these are cards that let us get into those as quickly as we can, and some of them are pretty broken. Mana Crypt and Sol Ring, for example, give us 2 extra mana by our second turn. Mana Crypt is especially good in this deck because the life loss is pretty much negligible when we have a life-linking general. So those ones are pretty unfair. And we've got Grim Monolith, Thran Dynamo, Gilded Lotus, and Coalition Relic. I like these two because we sometimes screw ourselves over with a ton of colorless mana sources, and it's nice to have some mana rocks that actually make colored mana. So those ones are good as well. Moving into the mana base of this deck, a good chunk of the mana base is dedicated to making sure we have access to our 2 colors. We're playing enemy colors, so our options are somewhat limited. Plateau and Sacred Foundry, these ones are great because they have basic land subtypes. They count as mountains and plains, which means that we can grab them with any fetch land. We're running 5 in this deck, maybe overkill, but it's nice to make sure we always have access to our dual lands. And then we've got Ancient Amphitheater, Battlefield Forge, Reflecting Pool, Rugged Prairie, City of Brass. Whatever dual lands you have access to, toss them in the deck. Try to go for the ones that don't come into play tapped because we're trying to build up tempo as best we can. So I think the cool thing about playing a 2-color deck is that you're at sort of a sweet spot where you get to play with a ton of utility lands. I think if you're playing a 3-color or a 5-color deck, most of your lands are going to be dedicated to making sure you have access to all of your colors. And if you're playing a 1-color deck, Usually it's a deck that's really dependent on having your basic lands out, like a black deck wants lots of swamps for coffers, and most decks want, as many basics as possible for Gauntlet of Power and extraplanar lands. So most decks, other than two-color decks, try to cut back on the utility lands, but in a two-color deck, you can usually run as many as you like. So I like the Cycle lands from Onslaught. Good utility, because you can turn them into cards late game. Some random ones like Shinka, Igandro Castle, Nubenalia. They don't do much, but, why not? Flagstones of Trocaire. This one's almost always going to be better than a Plains. Definitely don't forget about this one if you're running a ton of Armageddon effects like this deck is. It's just one more way you can make sure that you're going to have the upper hand after you blow up all the lands. I love Spine Rock Knoll in any aggressive deck because it's going to be card advantage, 7 damage in 1 turn. It's really easy when you're running Brion Stoutarm as a general. So don't forget about this one. I like this one a lot. Mistral Plains, pretty sure this is the best card of all time. Let's see, it's got a Plains subtype, which means you can grab it with a fetch land. The ability here seems kind of unassuming, but you saw a whole bunch of tutoring engines in this deck. We have Land Tax, we have Weathered Wayfarer, we have Sunforger, we have Stonehewer Giant, and these are all cards which can cause you to sort of blow through a lot of your resources in your deck really quickly. So it's nice to be able to recur those and bring them back, put them back in your deck so that you can grab them again with your tutoring engines. So definitely don't forget about this card. It's really relevant. Some more utility lands here. Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God, 2 fantastic cards, give you access to a mana ramp in a land. Ancient Tomb, of course, works very well with a life-linking general. The life loss is never really going to matter. Vesuva, always an interesting utility card. It can take down legendary lands. It can copy your Ancient Tomb or your Strip Mine or whatever. Usually worth running in a deck like this. Then Strip Mine and Dust Bowl. A lot of the time you're going to need to take down an opponent's land, like a Cabal Coffers or Academy Ruins. Sometimes a land like that is going to be the most threatening card on the board. So every deck needs to run a Strip Mine, I think, so you can take down those threats. And Dust Bowl is just another way we can attack someone's mana base. We've got a lot of ways to do that, and it's nice to have a land destruction engine that we can put in our mana base. So I like this one a lot. And then we have what I consider to be the 2 strongest aggressive lands in the format, and any aggressive deck that has access to these should be running them. Hall of the Bandalord. Haste is just the most important ability you can have for an aggressive deck. You want your creatures to be relevant as soon as they hit the board, and this is one way that you can do that. The life loss, again, completely negligible with Brion. You're going to gain back that life +1 the turn it comes out. So Hall of the Bandalord, one of the first lands you're going to want to tutor up with your Weathered Wayfarer, because this thing is going to be a game changer every time. And then Sunhome, Fortress of the Legion. One of the gems you have access to for playing red and white. Target creature gains double strike until end of turn. Very aggressive because we're running a lot of swords, and all of those swords benefit from dealing combat damage. So if you're giving that creature double strike, you're going to get double the effect, and as well as a ton of extra damage. So this is one of those really explosive cards that's going to help you get through someone's 40 points of life really quickly. So one of those gems you have access to for playing a really challenging color combination. And then rounding it out, we've got Plains and Mountains, all foily. So this deck has a ton of different ways you can win. If you get one of these awesome 1-drops in your opening hand, then you can go for the aggressive strategy. Hopefully you can back it up with some late game threats, and if you can draw into some of your equipments, then you're definitely going to have some options. Some of the utility lands really back up the aggressive strategy, and if you can get an Armageddon down, then you can stop the opponents from even having a chance to deal with your threats. So that's definitely a viable way this deck can win. Another thing you can do is just play the resource denial game. So use mass land destruction and non-basic land haters to just not let your opponent play spells. You've also got access to a bunch of utility removal and some creative ways to just stop your opponents from having access to the cards in their deck or the cards in their hand. Another straightforward way this deck can win is just by getting some of their mana artifacts out as early as possible and then ramp into a big Eldrazi. Any deck can win that way, definitely a reliable way to win. No matter how you end up assembling your win condition, it's probably going to involve one of the many tutoring engines that this deck has access to. These are really important because red and white doesn't have a whole lot of tutoring cards, so if you can get one of these engines online, then you have access to a lot of utility in your deck, and it'll give you some resiliency for the end game. If all else fails, you've got some sort of cheesy ways you can win. You can set up a Yosei lock, shut down somebody entirely, use Brion as your sack outlet, and then hopefully get some sort of recursion with Adarkar Valkyrie or Sword of Light and Shadow. Another way you can win is just a big Price of Progress or Vicious Shadows. These are cards that can come out of nowhere and just deal a ton of damage to your opponents before they even suspect it's going to come. And then of course, Brion's awesome synergy with Phyrexian Processor and Serra Avatar is always a reliable way to end the game. So that's the deck. I think this is a very fun deck to play. It's not something that people really expect to see. It's got so many different strategies, so many ways that it can win. Very, very interesting to play with. So hopefully you got some ideas. I think most Brion decks look pretty different than this one, but you know, maybe you'll get some ideas for yours. So if you have any suggestions, leave a comment or email me privately. Thank you.